Welcome to the Geopolitics and Business Briefing. Today's episode is a recording from a recent live webinar on China's 15th five-year plan and its implications for international companies. As Beijing doubles down on technological self-reliance, industrial upgrading, and what Beijing calls controllable supply chains, foreign firms face growing pressure to localize strategically in an increasingly competitive and policy-driven environment. In this session, Sinolytics senior consultant Bo Wen Han breaks down what the plan could mean across industries, from competition and regulation to procurement and governance. You may hear references to slides or comments from the live audience, as this, as I said, originally was a webinar.
So, right into our content today. The five-year plan. I'm sure everybody's heard about it, but I want to start still with a little bit of a basics. So what they are, or what it is, and what it is not. So here are 3 points that in my discussions that I find, even some of the veterans of Chinese business or Chinese policymaking might make these mistakes about the five-year plans, right? So I just want to quickly clarify them with all of you so that we are on the same page of what this document is and what to expect before we go into the details, all right? So first of all, what it is a strategic direction, but not operational details. So what that means is, so in Chinese policymaking, there are different layers of policies, and the five-year plans are the basic of the basic, which means the government will lay out their intent in these documents. So what you're gonna see is a very high-level strategic talking, and often a lack of operational detail. But don't be worried, that's how it's supposed to be, right? Because after the five-year plan, there will be specific plans for different industries, and then there will be, action plans. And then after the action plan, we then expect, more specific policy on, for example, how you can get some subsidy, how you can get some tax benefits. So all of these operational details are gonna come later, and we expect them in a rather short term, now that we have the full document of the five-year plan published, right? So keep that in mind as we go through the document, that this is supposed to be a very, very high level, sometimes it can feel like empty talk, word salad, but that's how it's supposed to be in the Chinese policy ecosystem, right? So yeah, that's the first point. And the second one, I also get a lot of questions of, especially from the foreign community, like from foreign business executives, that, all of this talk sounds great, right? But are they actually going to do this? Is the government actually going to follow up on what they say in the five-year plans? Or is this more of a propaganda, sometimes maybe a political slogan, something that they say to just to make it sound good, right? And the answer is that's not what you expect for five-year plans. For five-year plans, they are actually signals. They are actually meaningful indicators of policy, and we do expect the government to very much follow up on what they discuss in these plans, right? There are, of course, there are other policies where they just sort of make some propaganda, make something that sounds good, but that's not what they do in the five-year plans, all right? So we should take these very seriously. And any change they make, anything they say in the five-year plan, just expect that to happen in the next 5 years, all right? So that's the second point. Third, last but not least, these documents, as you might have noticed in the title, the 15th five-year plan. So they have been doing this for more than 70 years, basically for the entire history of the People's Republic of the nation. And so these documents, when you read it, they are supposed to be read in comparison, comparatively to the plans before, all right? And this is very important because when you look at such a document, such a five-year plan, which is, they're more than 140 pages long, and sometimes, especially when you read the translation, the English translation, right? A lot of these words sound kind of empty. You might get that feeling, and that's very usual, very common, because the Chinese government, when they write, as we said in the first point, right, these are the basis of policy documents. So they do want to leave some room for interpretation, so that, when they push out different operational policy details, action plans, they want to make sure that whatever action they propose in the following years, they want to make sure as much as possible that these action plans are not contradictory to the five-year plan, all right? Because that kind of signals policy continuity. So So the way that you read these words that can seem empty, can seem like word salad is comparatively, right? Whenever you read a 5-year plan, make sure to compare it with the previous one, even the ones before that would be 10 years ago, but the Chinese government, they make sure that these policy documents, if these 5-year plans are very much continuous, right? So and that also means a subtle change in what could seem like a very empty word, right? For example, when they say we want to grow something fastly and if they change it to we want to grow something strongly, fastly and strongly, that could mean a very different policy outlook in the next 5 years for us policy analysts, right? And also practical changes, practical differences for the foreign business on the ground. So the last point is always make sure that you read these policy documents in comparison to each other, and then everything will start to make sense. All right. So that's the 3 points generally about 5-year plans. And then we will go into this plan that we just had a few days ago, the 15th 5-year plan, which is again more than 140 pages long. Really long document. Is quite impossible to read the whole of it. So usually how we approach these long documents is to look for signs between the lines, right? So I want to start with this, again, a more high-level analysis of this year's 5-year plan, starting with the keywords, right? Keyword changes. And as you can see, we have a collection of keywords that basically appear in every 5-year plan. And the logic here is we try to compare the keyword count, how often they appear, how many times they appeared in this year's 5-year plan compared to the previous one. And that could be a very good first sign of the policy changes this year, right? Or rather for the next 5 years. So here, I want to share a few takeaways that we got from the keyword aspect. So first of all, the first box here is about economics, right? And here we see the keywords of development and economy was slightly reduced, but stable or stability one was increased by a lot, by 30%. So I think we would interpret this as also continuously with the recent policy that China is transitioning from this phase of fast growth to a phase of economic stability, where, as the government would put it, quality of development is now prioritized over quantity. Of course, this is also kind of a necessity given China's development stage. As the country is already reaching a middle income country level, it's just impossible to grow at 10% per year. What I want to say is about this point, it is not necessarily negative, all right? But rather I would say it is a pretty positive change in my point of view, because when the government, they gave out the plan, they give out a target or a number in the 5-year plan. It's from the central government. And that puts a lot of pressure on the regional government to do whatever they can to meet that target, right? And previously, what kind of happened is when they push out the really high target, the local government, they would do something that, would make the top line figure of GDP growth look good, but maybe not the most efficient thing to do, right? For example, investing in infrastructure, when the infrastructure is already very good, where the monetary return, the efficiency of investment might not be the best. So this year, they are really, as you have seen in the government work report, they already reduced the GDP target from 5% to 4.525%. So I think that's actually quite practical change, and that would reduce some of the pressures on regional government, on the regional officials, decision makers on how to where to put their investment, so that they can really spend money to more efficiently rather than just to meet this top line target, right? Second point about technology. So technology is definitely the top priority right now, and is at the top of I think the 12th task you see from the government. And the first keyword is AI. Obviously now we see a huge growth of this keyword compared to 5 years ago, but also technology overall. We see almost 50% growth, right? And green is still, there's still a growth, a mentioning of green development. So also a pretty clear sign that technology is going to be the core battleground, that's going to be very much a policy focus in the next 5 years, all right? Then the third point, really, perhaps the most significant change for this 5-year plan is really the policy policymakers are turning their attention to welfare, right? Welfare is moving up the agenda by a lot. If you look at these keywords, employment, consumption, livelihood/welfare, they are all increased by a lot, right? Really significantly, 80% here, 50%, 30% here, right? And we will discuss this also later in the detail, but really this is one of the most significant changes in this 5-year plan, in the 15th 5-year plan. We're really welfare, employment, raising the income of people, domestic consumption is really put on a much higher weight compared to the previous plans. All right. Last but not least, this point is actually also very interesting to me that you see there's a reduction. So we talk about a lot of the increase of mentioning of keywords, right? So what is being reduced, and that would be these three, right? Reform, 改革, socialism, 社会主义, and security, 安全. So these keywords, they appear a lot, right, in the 14th 5-year plan, in the previous plan, but now they're being reduced to 16% to 35, 37, almost 40%. So that also means like this year, they're focusing more on, I would say, more concrete policy directions, right? Like technology and welfare. Whereas the mentioning of reform of ideology is kind of receding for a few possible different reasons, right? Maybe they are not feeling more secure on that ground, or they just want to focus more on these more measurable results, right? So definitely keep these 4 themes in mind as we go into the details. So next, again, on a little bit more into the details of this year's 5-year plan, all right? What is different in this year's plan compared to the previous one, the 14th 5-year plan 5 years ago? So here I'm laying out my observations. On the left-hand side, I think what you might feel after reading the whole document is that, as we mentioned here previously, right, in the first slide, that these documents are supposed to be very strategic, right, very high level. They're supposed to be mentioning a very high level general direction and not really going into the operational details. And what I feel is that this year it is even more so in that direction, right? So in most of the policy areas, especially consumption, we see even more strategic policy plan without specifics. So they are even more focusing on the high level part, on the strategic direction, rather than on the specific tools on how they will achieve that for most of the policy direction, but not all of them, right? And I think because that is really, because this year they're pushing this really major transformation in policy direction, in consumption, right? This is a really significant strategic shift as the country is trying to rebalance their growth model towards consumption-driven growth from investment and export-led growth model, which is basically what China built its whole economy on, right? So, and as they make this transformation, I think the government is trying to do 2 things here, right? So number one, they want to be very clear in their policy intent. So they want to be very clear to tell everybody that, okay, we're going to make this transformation into a consumption-driven growth, all right? So they're talking a lot about the strategic part, but also they want to leave ample room. They want to leave enough room for interpretation for further more operational, more detailed policy plans for the different ministries, the different provinces, right? So that's why we're seeing even more strategic policy document this year, and with limited action details in a lot of areas, but mostly consumption, right? So as you might remember, that a lot of analysts, including us, we were expecting a very specific number that would be really important in our point of view, that really show the government's dedication to elevating consumption. That is this number, right? Consumption as a share of GDP. So a lot of analysts from different organizations, from domestic think tanks, for international investment banks, they all talk about this, right? They were kind of expecting that the government would put this number as a target in the 5-year plan, because this was already raised, I think, during the 3rd plenum, if you remember. That would be the government meeting that is focused on economic policy making, right? So there have been it's already an idea that had been floated for a while, for at least more than 1 year, all right? So a lot of people were expecting this numerical target to be rolled into the 5-year plan. But in the end, of course, that was not the case. But the absence of that target, I think, was also significant. So a lot of people are a little bit disappointed, which is, of course, understandable that the government is not putting down this very detailed target, and I think that is a correct interpretation. But also, what this really shows is they want to maintain strategic flexibility as the transition unfolds, right? Because as you all know, as we are all reading in the news, apart from the domestic situation, the current geopolitical environment is also very, very challenging, right? With the conflict in Middle East, the Strait of Hormuz, the Iran situation, it is very clear that the policymakers in Beijing, they want to maintain this strategic flexibility. So they would, because when they write the target into the 5-year plan, they have to meet it, right? Otherwise, it will be really bad look. So they don't want to overpromise here, but really on this front, what's important is that we keep monitoring, right? Because as I said, policy tools and the specifics are expected to come later. Probably in the short term in this year, hopefully, right? There's no clear timeline on this, but usually what they do is in the months following the 5-year plan, they would push out more of the policy details, right? So this is a general picture. So for most of the policy areas in the plan, there's more strategy than specifics. But however, right, that brings us to really our topic of today in localization, because localization and supply chain security is the exception, right? Here we see not only strategy, but also already very much actionable policy being mentioned in the 5-year plan. And I really want to emphasize how important this is, right? Because as I said, when the government mentions something in the 5-year plan, they have to follow up. So usually the 5-year plan is very vague. They don't want to bring a lot of actionable policy. They don't want to overpromise in these kind of documents. But one area that we are seeing they already make a lot of promises is in the term of localization, right? In the terms of supply chain security. So of course, this is already an area that has been discussed in the previous 5-year plan, right? As I said, we have to always read these documents comparatively. But this year in the 15th 5-year plan, it was elevated even further, right? They put even more emphasis on that compared to the 14th 5-year plan. And what they're saying now is industrial resilience and supply chain security, right? Of course, this is not a surprise to anybody, of course. We already know that they are mentioning this in a lot of other policies, especially given the background, the context of Trump 2.0, as we see a globally rising trend of protectionism. This is really a policy necessity, right? And really what we see that's really noticeable and what's really important is that they are already pushing out at least 3 very, very specific, very actionable measures in the 5-year plan already, right? This is quite uncommon, I would say, among the 5-year plans. That would include industrial chain risk monitoring, strategic backup production bases, and of course, stronger control over critical materials and technologies, right? And we all know what this is referring to in the critical materials part, but also technologies going into R&D, right? They want to keep technological sovereignty. So on the ground, that might mean your partners, your Chinese partners, if you're in a joint venture, perhaps they are now pushing for acquisition of your technology, your foreign technology, or they might want your corporate entity to localize more in production and also in R&D within China, right? So this is a general feeling of the 5-year plan. Generally more strategic focused, but very much already into the actionable part in the supply chain and in localization. So with that, I want to also go into a very specific policy piece, specifically on localization. All right. So this one, what's on the slide here is a very new policy. Really, it was floated in September 2025, so late last year. But now it is effective in January 1st, 2026, starting this year. All right. So what this policy is about is the definition of domestic product, right? This is a policy of the definition of a domestic product, 国产产品. And why is it significant? I think we have most of our participants here are from foreign business, right? And I think a common shared experience is that in government procurement or in any procurement in general, you would feel like, or there's a perception that the local product would be prioritized over foreign product, right? And at a European chamber, at a German chamber, at every chamber, this is a persistent complaint, right? Everybody is complaining that, okay, you're saying that everybody's on the same playing ground, but what we feel like is actually you're still prioritizing Chinese products over our product, which is made by a foreign company, right? So what this policy does is, for the first time, I think in history, the Chinese government is pushing out this very clear definition of what is a domestic product, right? So they are preparing this policy to tell everybody what you have to do for your product to be classified as made in China. So this is very, very important in government bidding, right? And overall, I think two things about this document. Number one, it's a very common carrot and stick strategy from the Chinese government, right? So what they're doing is they're pushing out some benefits if you localize. So if you follow through on localized production, they're going to give you some benefits. But if not, there will be the stick, right? You will have a lot of disadvantage in government bidding. So that's number one, carrot and stick. Number two, again, this is a very long-term plan. So there will be a transition period of up to 10 years. So right now, they're just proposing this definition for public procurement only, indeed. So we don't really have the specific numbers yet. So this is the key number threshold here. What they're saying is they will publish this within the next 5 years. So we might wait up to 5 years for this number to be published. And then after this number is published, there will be a 3 to 5 year transition period. So put together, there could be up to 10 years of wait before this policy is fully implemented. All right. So this is a very long-term policy, and there will be ample room, ample time for everybody to prepare. So, but what the policy is actually saying, basically just this one thing, right? This one formula, that is, for your product to be classified as made in China, there will be a very simple rule. That is, if the cost of components produced within China as a share of total component cost of the product is larger than a prescribed threshold, than a percentage, then your product will be seen as made in China. And that will mean that you get this very sweet 20% price reduction for bid evaluation process, right? So apparently everybody wants to do this. There's a pretty strong incentive for everybody to localize your production. But of course, the problem is we don't have this key number yet, right? This key number, it will be different across sectors and products, and we don't have it yet. And it could be published, it could not be published for as much as 5 years. So right now, we don't have this yet. Also, I want to emphasize that in the calculation of this cost of total components, they will be looking into tier 1 and tier 2 components, right? Tier 1 components is, of course, what you use to manufacture or to make your product. And tier 2 components is the supplier of your suppliers, right? So that's also put into the calculation here. They want to make sure that the supplier to your supplier is also made in China, right? So they're really going deep into what we call in the analyst space tier X suppliers. So it's not only you, but your suppliers and the suppliers to your suppliers. So there's a multi-tier of localization here, right? Not only your manufacturing, yes. And then, last but not least, of course, with most of the Chinese policies, all of these sound very good, right? They sound pretty sweet. Now, finally, we have a clear definition of what is a made in China product, right? And everybody now can strive to, localize and meet the target, right? Well, yes and no, because if you look at the last bullet point, there is a mentioning of other requirements might apply, right? Other requirements. And this, very importantly, this is not specified what is the other requirements, all right? Because if you just look at this slide, this whole policy, what they're talking about is really manufacturing. So apart from this last bullet point, it kind of sounded like if we made this stuff in China, even if the technology is not made in China, even if the IP, the technology still belong to the German or Japanese headquarters, it kind of sounded like that as long as we made this in China, then it could be classified as made in China. But then, of course, the government also thought about that. So other requirements might apply is what they put at the last bullet point. This is not classified. This is not explained yet, and it is fully possible that as the government in the following years, as they look into this, they might change their mind, right? And they might suddenly say, okay, R&D in China is not part of the other requirements. Actually, what we changed our mind, actually, right? We want you to also transfer your technology to the Chinese entity before your product can be classified as made in China, all right? So there's they kind of leave this room for change before this policy can be fully implemented, as we said, in 10 years, right? That's a really long period of time. So yes, just keep it in mind. And this is overall, I would say this is a pretty typical Chinese policymaking, of course, that the government, they would push out this policy with some carrots and stick, but at the end of the day, they will leave some room for interpretation for themselves, so that if they see this policy as not fit, so that if they want to also push for technology localization in the future, they have that room to do so. All right. So this slide, I think, also served as a good work sample from us, from Sinolytics. And I think we are currently working on this policy. I think we just helped the major German client on this, on how on implementing their product, localization of their product. All right. So this is an area that we can help you. And if you're interested, feel free to reach out to us. So with that, I want to, enough of the details, all right? I don't want to talk too much about details. That could be a little bit boring. We are, most of the participants here, I think, are executives. So we want to talk about decision-making, all right? How to assess whether you should localize or not, right? Because localization, that also comes with a lot of cost, with a lot of risk even, with, IP, technology, a lot of clients, a lot of our clients are worried that if we move this stuff to China, maybe our Chinese clients might copy our technology or whatever, right? So now we want to talk about a little bit on how to make your decision on whether to localize or not, right? So here, on this slide, we bring out two factors to consider. That is R&D. So how you do your R&D and what sector or what industry you are in. Just as a starter for discussion, or as a starter to thought on how do you localize. So as I said here in the title, localization pressure could be both a risk and an opportunity, right? Because as there's more pressure to localize, there will be a more complete product development ecosystem in China. And what a lot of companies are doing is that they are now using China as the research and development, as the R&D hub, right? They want to do research here. We're seeing that a lot in the healthcare industry, but also a lot of other industry, right? Because the scientists and engineers here in China are cheap and high quality, right? So that could be an opportunity as we see more localization pressure in China. So choose your game wisely, right? Think about this and really have a discussion within your board on whether you want to localize or not, or how much you want to localize, because localization is, I think, not a yes or no question, right? Because or rather it's a spectrum on how much you localize. You can choose like any number from 10%, 20%, all the way up to 90%, 100% within your whole value chain, all right? So 2 points here, R&D and sector. So for R&D, the top half here is pretty much our interpretation or the quote from the 5-year plans, right? So now they're saying they want to emphasize industrial ecosystem, linking firms, universities, and research institutes, right? They want to promote industrial clusters and innovation alliances. So this is, I think, really part of the opportunity side, or part of the carrot side to localization. For foreign businesses that are more localized in China, there's now I think, a very, very, very real opportunity to engage in the Chinese R&D ecosystem, because as I said, a lot of universities here are now top in the world, right? In the areas of healthcare, life sciences, AI, computer sciences, engineering, obviously, right? So if you choose to localize your R&D here, there is a very real opportunity to engage with the local universities. And we are already seeing companies doing that, right? They do a lot of all kinds of collaboration with the local Chinese universities and research institutes in terms of, they might establish a joint research facility or a joint research, or they might finance a project at a Chinese university. And then this would see increased policy support, innovation networks, and industrial programs. Basically, the whole benefit of accessing China's R&D ecosystem, right? But then maybe a little bit on the risk side is you have to also consider what sector you are in, which industry you are in, because as China is now saying, technology self-sufficiency is not their top priority, right? We do expect very much expanded support for industries that the government see as so-called future industries and frontier technologies, and of course anything that can be interpreted as related to national security, right? Semiconductor, for example. So we do expect both a high policy pressure and of course very high pressure in local competition in these sectors that are considered strategic focus and national security relevant. So you might consider maybe not so much localization, or maybe on a lower end of the localization spectrum if your industry is related in these strategic and national security sectors. All right. So strategic options. Is it worth it to localize? I think this is really connected, right? There are at least three pillars that are interconnected with each other here. There are national security, market access, and local competition. All right. And as we said, in terms of national security, how these two are connected. As long as your sector is not considered part of the national security apparatus or not broadly related to China's national security, I think then we would be generally on the optimistic side on policy-related market access. That is, we would say the Chinese government is pursuing this so-called selective opening. And there is actually quite consistent policy signal from Beijing that they want the market to still be open to foreign businesses, right? So as long as your product is not, strict military or, very, very specifically semiconductor related in some of the areas that China has very clearly said that they want local players to make those products, then we would think, okay, it is generally possible for you to gain market access in China. All right, so national security or not being related to national security will lead to market access. But then, of course, what we're hearing a lot from our clients is that also the Chinese local competition are rising, right? You might heard about the phrase of overcapacity, or in Beijing's words, that would be anti-involution, meaning that the Chinese market is really not very, very competitive. So even if you have market access, in the perfect world that you have perfect market access, it might still not be worth it to fully localize if your sector is very saturated with Chinese local competition, right? So that's the next thing to compare: market access and local competition. And I think really the point to look at here is beware of hidden/local protections. This is what they're trying to remove in the 5-year plan when they talk about a unified national market, right? But it is still sometimes the case. It still exists that when you go into a business procurement, when you go to the bidding process, this has not come from the central government, but more often from the provincial or the city government, who want to protect their local champion, right? They want to protect their local company because it is a major employment source and a major tax source for their province or for their city, right? So there might be hidden protections, local protections that make the situation on the ground different from what they're saying in the national level policy, right? So just keep it in mind. It is totally possible, all right? So, and also then local competition towards national security. Here, I want to bring in this concept of the desired market structure from the Chinese government, right? So as I said, the Chinese government want to make the market open to foreign businesses, but at the end of the day, what they want is they in the very far future, at the end of the day, they always want a Chinese company on top of any industry, right? This is very clear. I think in the automotive industry, we are seeing it more so also in engineering, in heavy machinery. A lot of Chinese companies, even state-owned companies, they are being really efficient. They're being really good. Perhaps this, but going a bit slow in other industries like healthcare or life sciences, where they are still allowing a lot of foreign companies come in because the domestic players are simply not good enough, right? If in your industry, the Chinese players, or in other words, how much the Chinese government welcomes a foreign business as we see it on the ground, very much depends on how good the local competition is. So if the local competition is very good, if they are already at the top of the technology globally, then you can expect the maybe not so welcoming market, right? So at the end of the day, the market structure is also considered in the national security, or sort of a broader national security spectrum, right? Where the government always want the local player to be at the top. So what this means is, I think really for foreign businesses, we need to think about our end game, right? Think about your end game. What are you gonna do if that happens, right? I think because everything is sort of moving in this direction as China incubates their local champions, their local players, to become competitors, to become players in the global market, or as a top performers in the global market. So what's your end game here? Do you want to produce in China? So if you localize, do you want to export from China, sort of like what Tesla did? I guess if you look at the life cycle of Tesla, that is really symbolizes what the Chinese government sees as the whole life cycle of a foreign company, right? So if you remember, a few years ago, the Chinese EV industry was in its infancy, right? It's very much just being born. And then at that time, Chinese government gave Tesla a lot of benefits for them to set up this huge factory in Shanghai and give them a lot of benefits, right? And Tesla did localize, and they also they also started using Chinese local suppliers. But the result of that is the Chinese local suppliers to Tesla became really good. And then the Chinese government was able to incubate these local electric vehicle champions, so that now Tesla is, they still occupy a part of the EV market, but they're sort of being squeezed out by the local competition. And now what they're doing is largely exporting from China to other parts of the world. So that's a pretty typical cycle of foreign business in China, I would say. So think about where you are, right? Where your industry is in this cycle of being welcomed in as a catfish, the so-called catfish effect, and then maybe slowly being squeezed out by local competition as they get good, and whether it is possible for your industry to pursue an end game like Tesla, where you make them in China and then ship them to other markets, perhaps starting with the markets that are more friendly to China, like the Southeast Asia or Middle East, but then maybe also at the end trying to export back to your home market, right, to Europe and America, if that's possible. So all of this is just a little bit of initial thoughts that we want to present here for really for you to start your strategic thinking on localization. Yes, and that's pretty much what we prepared for today's content. I think we can then move into Q&A, or Teresa, Bjorn, if you have anything to say. I think, yeah, back to you, Teresa.
Thanks a lot. I saw a few questions dropping into the chat regarding domestic product definition. Here's the question: how do you see the likelihood that this regulation shifts to private businesses as well, and how fast and in which sectors will we see this first coming?
Yeah, that's really the million-dollar question, right? Because I think we don't really have clear signals there yet. But what I want to emphasize here is, as you said, right, the government procurement is likely the first step. Like when the Chinese government roll out everything, like for example, the so-called Xinchuang initiative, where they try to localize even the Windows operating system, they always start with public procurement, right? Where they usually start with the government procurement, with state-owned enterprise procurement, and then they would push it out to private businesses or to the private area, possibly if the trial with the government sector or with the public sector is successful. So I think we don't know that yet, but that's probably going to come in rather long-term timeline, I would say, because the first step with even the government procurement is they're doing this in up to 10 years, right?
And perhaps to add just one thought, Hai Shenwei, by the way, I always can count on you on to pose the $1 million question. What I would add to that is kind of the informal dimension of all of this. I would agree with Bowen kind of on the formal rules and how they will shape and will take shape. But there's also kind of this informal effect, right? If you push out rules like this, clear and firm rules like this for public procurement, it tends to have an effect also on how private actors within the Chinese government see things, interpret things, kind of also do things in many ways. So there's an informal spillover effect that will also kind of lead to some movement into that direction of these firm government rules for public procurement. Also spill over into the private sector. So I think we will see some of that at least.
Thank you. Then we had a follow-up question right on that topic. Like, how does this, is it protectionism, and how does it differ from US or European local content requirements?
Yeah, is this protectionism? Well, yes and no. I think what the policy is trying to do here is really setting up a policy where in an area that is currently quite chaotic, right? There's currently no clear definition here. So, or really, I think, technically, right? Technically, the current definition is that as long as you make something in China, it should be considered a domestic product. But there's no clear policy on that. And as a lot of you may know, that's not what you're experiencing on the ground. So I would say this is really the government. What they're trying to do is establish a rule. And it is clearly, we can say it is some sort of protectionism, but really what it also does is sort of alleviate the protectionist problem, because a lot of local governments right now, what they're doing on the ground that is not written in the policies is a lot worse, right, than what is written here formally in the policy. They just prioritize their local champion like infinitely, not even 20%. So I think generally I would interpret this as a relatively positive development as they try to establish a clear rule on all of this, the procurement issue.
Another question, in a very regulated market like life science, the local fast pace of change in Chinese requirements is a challenge for global companies. How best stay connected to what is becoming operational and actionable?
Yeah, that's a very good question. Yes. I would say just keep up with our policy monitoring, right? We do this for a lot of clients in life science, of course, and a lot more industries, but I think it's really important to have real-time policy monitoring in China. As you said, it's a very regulated market, and if you don't, if you do keep your attention with policy, what policy they're pushing out, as I said, a policy in China, it might seem like it came out of nowhere, but that's usually not the case. Usually, it's preceded by the 5-year plan and some industry plan, and there's an action plan, and then finally they push out this policy that have a lot of impact on your business. And if you don't do real-time policy monitoring, you might be caught surprised, right? You don't want to do that. So I think the answer is to really do real-time policy monitoring, do it broadly from different government ministries, and there will be signals. Usually there will be signals before really game-changing policy is pushed out.
And I think another like $1 million question is, what would you recommend foreign companies to avoid an endgame scenario as described?
Yeah, Bjorn, maybe you can start on this more strategic question.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think there's I think the worst case scenario, if you're look at localization as basically localization by market access, and you kind of want to make sure that you get what you came for, basically what you get your localization worth of market access at the end. I think kind of one of the worst case scenarios is really kind of to push very hard in a sector where the end game does not really see a significant role for foreign companies. Everything that is kind of highly strategic, kind of very security related, I think they are kind of going into a mode of kind of very deep localization might end up in a very unfortunate situation where you have localized everything, do not have the market access that you want from it, and then don't know what to do next. So that would be, I think that would be the prime example of something to avoid. But at the same time, always kind of there's a balance to be struck here, and there's obviously something, as Bowen also noted, there's also opportunity in localization, and you have to weigh very, very carefully. As I said, kind of it's at the end, it's product level where it really happens, and that's where you have to go also with analysis.
More questions coming in. We heard that China welcomes foreign companies primarily in sectors where it wants to stimulate local growth, with the ultimate goal of having a Chinese champion at the top. For a foreign company that enters the system, how do we define winning in the long term?
Yeah, perhaps I can just kind of continue my thought because it kind of connects directly to what I just said.
Yep.
I think the what you have to do as a company is really kind of to make your own definition on kind of what do you want out of the Chinese market. Are you happy with a certain niche of a certain size in a certain sector, right? And are you is it worth it for you if you can sustainably over the long term defend that niche, right? And if that is the case, and you read all the signs and right, and you analyze your product and your situation really correctly, and you kind of you define the right level of localization that you need for that, and you end up with that niche that you can defend and that you were happy that you were aiming for. Then you have won basically on that front, right? However, kind of you have to kind of make really sure kind of what is enough at the end, and is it worth the effort, right? So that's a big balance. That's a big balancing decision that you will have to make.
Are there any indications on potential export restrictions that might impact supply chains from China with production in Europe or the US?
Yes. So for this, China have this list of export restriction in product, in technology. They are two separate lists and they're updated regularly. I think in terms of indication or signal, if you look at these lists, most of them are from industries that China considered strategic or national security related. And these, they are mentioned in the 5-year plan if you go over it, and in a lot of policy documents. So yeah, I think the first step is the industry, like what industry you're in. But of course, also being up to date in everything else, right? The recent policy, the recent discussions, or even the geopolitical dynamic between Europe, US, and China.
Mm-hmm. Next question. What arguments could counter the growing narrative in European governments that companies should just move out of China, considering the long-term goal of establishing Chinese champions anyway? What could be the benefit along the way for European companies before being pushed out or becoming fully Chinese?
Yeah, perhaps Bjorn, you could follow up, but I think I would say that end goal, as we said, the Chinese government always wants a Chinese player on the top, but have a player on the top does not mean they have 100% of the market share, right? And more often than not, what we see is there's still an ample market. China is a huge market, right? 1.4 billion people, and as the government pivots to domestic consumption, it's going to grow even larger, right? And if you're able to capture even a small amount, a small share of the market, for a lot of European companies, especially those who are family-owned, perhaps smaller in size, they have pretty 10%, 20%, or single digit of the Chinese market would make enough of a case for them to stay in China. Is what we see in practice from corporate decision making.
Very specific.
And perhaps,
oh, sorry.
Sorry, just perhaps to add kind of this one thought, and kind of we are kind of repeating the same mantra. Basically, it depends on the exact product and the exact place that you can reasonably expect to have over a longer period of time in China. But then obviously kind of the other component that comes into this whole equation is that the Chinese competition is obviously there, it's growing stronger, and it will not only be limited to China. So you will face Chinese competition everywhere else in the world as well. Not only in your home markets in Europe, but also kind of in Latin America, Southeast Asia, wherever you go, right? You will face Chinese competition. So there might be a case to be made to have kind of to at least stay close to that in some degree to prepare yourselves better for the Chinese competition that you will face in any case. If you are in China or not, you will face Chinese competition in most sectors, most cases. So being prepared for that might be part of your internal equation.
Okay, pretty specific question. Are there any indications of potential extension of end-user transparency in export requirements beyond the rare earth sector?
Yeah, what I can see now is some of our clients are already considering this, right? As you said, it's already happening in rare earths. So I think the best way to approach it is to have this knowledge set up within internally, right? To have your tier X suppliers documented on where they source their stuff from anywhere, from anything. I would recommend to just be prepared for this. Yeah.
No, and I can add the general point. I think in a geopolitical world that we now live in, having a much deeper internal transparency of your supply chain will be necessary for every company, and it's going to be the necessity is going to be much higher than even 2, 3, 4 years ago. So yes, be prepared.
Dear listener or viewer, thank you for joining us for this episode of the Geopolitics and Business Briefing. If you want to dive deeper into this topic or explore the wider geopolitical developments shaping business risk, you can find the full analysis and much more on Geolytics Hub, your 24/7 access point for geopolitical intelligence. You got any feedback or a topic you want us to unpack? Drop us a note at podcast@geo-lytics.com. Thanks again, and we look forward to having you with us next time in the briefing room.